The boardroom was a tomb of obsidian and glass, cold enough to make a person's breath visible if it weren't for the suffocating tension. Zola Mariam stood at the center of the room, her combat boots silent against the marble as the Iron Dragon's elite security detail erupted in jagged, mocking laughter. One lieutenant stepped forward, deliberately spitting on the floor near her feet, his eyes scanning her with a mixture of cultural disdain and professional mockery. The Iron Dragon is the most feared name in Seoul, yet we hire an American girl who looks like she got lost on the way to a nightclub? He sneered. Zola didn't blink, her hollow gaze remaining fixed on Park Junho, who sat in the shadows at the head of the table. When the hiring manager demanded to see her certifications, she didn't reach for a folder. She slid a single, blood-stained photograph across the mahogany. It was a satellite shot of a fortified Libyan black site reduced to charred rubble. The room went dead silent as the experts realized the scale of the destruction. 47 trained operatives stood between me and the exit, Zola stated, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. I am the only one in that photo still breathing. The silence following Zola Mariam's revelation was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a localized disaster. Park Junho remained anchored in his high-backed chair, his tattooed hands steepled beneath his chin as he stared at the woman who had just silenced a room full of killers with a single image. The clock on the far wall, a minimalist masterpiece of brushed steel, ticked with a rhythmic finality that seemed to echo the beating of a drum. It was exactly 6 p.m. In 24 hours, the full moon would hang high over the Gangnam skyline, and if the message carved into his head of security's chest was accurate, it would be the last thing Junho ever saw. He stood slowly, the movement drawing the eyes of every man in the room, and gestured toward the wall of monitors displaying the compound's perimeter. The bounty is $25 million, Junho said, his voice a low vibration that carried the weight of a crumbling empire. Every professional from here to Vladivostok is currently checking their gear. You have 24 hours to make sure they fail. Zola didn't wait for a formal contract or a handshake. She turned away from the table, her eyes already scanning the architecture of the room for vulnerabilities, treating the legendary Iron Dragon as if he were merely another asset to be secured. The first 12 hours are for fortification, she said, her tone clinical and devoid of the fear that usually permeated conversations with the syndicate leader. The final 12 are for the wait. If you want to live, you will give me total command of your internal security protocols. Anyone who deviates from my instructions is a variable I will eliminate. The lieutenants bristled, their hands twitching toward concealed holsters, but Junho silenced them with a single, sharp glance. He was a man who had built his kingdom on intuition, and his intuition told him that this woman was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. The lockdown began with the precision of a surgical strike. While the rest of the city began to glow with the neon pulse of nightlife, the Iron Dragon's compound descended into a strategic darkness. Zola moved through the hallways like a predatory shadow, her footsteps making no sound on the expensive silk rugs. She started with the human element, the most volatile part of any defense. She ordered the immediate dismissal of 40% of the staff, those whose loyalty was bought with a paycheck rather than forged in blood. The remaining 60% were gathered in the main courtyard, where she stood before them under the flickering security lights. She didn't give a speech about loyalty or the glory of the Iron Dragon. She spoke only of the mechanics of survival. She assigned sectors, established nonverbal communication cues, and made it clear that the compound was no longer a home, it was a kill zone. By 10 p.m., the physical transformation of the estate was underway. Zola requisitioned tactical gear that the syndicate usually reserved for street wars: communication jammers, thermal optics, and high-frequency motion sensors. She personally oversaw the installation of pressure plates beneath the manicured grass of the northern gardens and the hidden wiring of the ivy-covered walls with non-lethal electrical grids. She wasn't building a wall to keep people out. She was designing a funnel to trap them in. "Why not guns?" a young lieutenant asked, watching her meticulously check the tension on a series of tripwires. "Guns are loud." Zola replied without looking up. Laughter is louder, but silence is what wins. We aren't here to have a shootout. We are here to make 50 people disappear before they realize they've been hunted. As the clock crept toward midnight, the psychological toll of the 24-hour sentence began to show. Junho retreated to his office, a reinforced sanctuary that Zola had stripped of its luxury to favor tactical utility. He watched her on the monitors, a lone figure moving through the shadows of his own home, and realized that he had spent his entire life being the hunter, only to find that the role of the prey was far more exhausting. The air grew colder as the moon rose higher, a silver eye watching the silent preparations. Zola entered the office to conduct a final sweep, her presence bringing a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She checked the seals on the bulletproof glass and the integrity of the hidden exit beneath the mahogany bookcase. 12 hours left, she whispered, more to the room than to the man sitting in it. The sentence was halfway served, and the most dangerous part of the night was only just beginning to stir in the shadows beyond the walls. The 24-hour clock was a heavy weight that pressed against the chest of every man in the Iron Dragon Syndicate. But for some, the pressure manifested as a toxic need to reassert a crumbling hierarchy. As the countdown reached the 20-hour mark, the tension inside the compound shifted from external dread to internal friction. Zola Mariam moved through the secondary security hub, her eyes scanning a bank of thermal monitors that mapped the estate in ghostly blues and oranges. Behind her, the air grew thick with the familiar, acrid scent of defiance. It was Kang, the same lieutenant who had spat on the marble floor during her interview, now standing with 3 other guards who looked more like they were preparing for a mutiny than a siege. Kang's presence was a jagged edge in a room that Zola required to be surgically smooth. He leaned against a rack of tactical gear, his arms crossed over a chest adorned with the Syndicate's dragon tattoos, his gaze lingering on Zola with a deliberate, slow-burning disrespect. The boss might be blinded by his own fear, but some of us still remember how this world works, Kang said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of a decade spent in the Busan gutters. He stepped into Zola's personal space, the smell of nicotine and unearned confidence radiating from him. You think because you showed us a pretty picture of a fire in Libya that we're going to take orders from an American girl? You're a distraction, Mariam, a gimmick for a man who's lost his nerve. He looked at his companions, seeking the validation of their smirks, and found it. Gender is a weakness in this business. You're built for the soft parts of life, not for holding the line when the wolves come for the dragon. He reached out, a slow, mocking gesture intended to brush a stray coil of her hair, a final assertion of his supposed dominance. Zola didn't flinch, but the atmosphere in the room changed instantly, the temperature seeming to drop as she stepped into the vacuum of his arrogance. Before Kang's fingers could make contact, she moved with the precise, economical violence that had been burned into her muscle memory through years of Black Ops training. It wasn't a flashy move. It was a clinical extraction of a threat. Her left hand caught his wrist, the bone popping with a sickening, wet sound as she used his own momentum to spiral him toward the floor. Simultaneously, her right palm struck the nerve cluster at the base of his jaw with the force of a hydraulic press. Kang didn't have time to scream. His knees hit the floorboards, the shock of the pain short-circuiting his nervous system before his brain could even process that he was no longer the aggressor. The other 3 guards reached for their holsters, but Zola was already in their blind spots, her movements a blur of controlled shadow. She didn't draw a weapon. She used the environment, a heavy equipment case, a metal table edge, the very air itself, to dismantle their formation. A strike to a windpipe, a knee to a thigh, a palm to a temple. In less than 9 seconds, the 3 men were staggered, gasping for air and clutching limbs that no longer obeyed them. Zola returned her attention to Kang, who was slumped against the wall, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. She knelt beside him, her face inches from his, her expression as flat and hollow as the Libyan desert at midnight. Gender is irrelevant when you're struggling to draw air through a crushed windpipe, Zola whispered, her voice devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. You think your tattoos make you a soldier? They just make you a target. You are a variable I cannot afford. And in 24 hours, variables are the things that get people killed. She stood up, looking over the broken men with the same clinical detachment she used for the security monitors. You wanted to know my credentials? You just felt them. Now, you will spend the next 20 hours in the holding cells, or I will ensure you never stand up again. The wolves are coming, and I don't have time to teach children how to behave. Park Junho watched the entire exchange from the shadows of the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the corridor. He saw the raw efficiency of the woman he had hired, the way she had neutralized 4 of his most experienced men without breaking a sweat or losing her focus. He realized then that Zola Mariam wasn't just a protector. She was a reminder of the brutal reality he had forgotten in his years of luxury. As the guards were dragged away in shamed silence, Zola turned back to the monitors, her hands steady as she resumed the lockdown protocols. The internal threat had been silenced, proving that in her world there were no men or women. There were only those who survived and those who were left behind. The clock on the wall of the Iron Dragon's reinforced sanctum shifted to the 16-hour mark, its rhythmic ticking sounding more like a countdown to an execution. Zola Mariam moved through the dim corridors of the mansion, her hands steady as she calibrated a series of pressure plates beneath the ornate floorboards. These were not the crude instruments of a street war. They were highly sensitive tactical triggers designed to map an intruder's footfall before they even realized they were being watched. Park Junho followed her, his shadow stretching long and jagged against the minimalist concrete walls. He watched her work with a growing sense of unease, noting how she handled the high-frequency sensors with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. She was transforming his palace into a living, breathing trap, a structural extension of her own hypervigilance. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and chilled metal as she wired a concealed electrical grid into the mahogany paneling. "You work like someone who has spent more time in the dark than the light," Junho remarked, his voice echoing in the hollow hallway. Zola didn't stop her work. Her fingers danced across a control module, bypassing the mansion's standard security to implement her own Spectre protocols. "The light is where you get killed," she replied, her tone as cold as the liquid nitrogen cooling the compound's main server. "In the dark, you are just a ghost among other ghosts, and ghosts don't have to explain why they're still breathing." She moved to the next sector, kneeling to install a series of tripwires connected to non-lethal flashbangs and chemical sedatives. Junho leaned against a marble pillar, watching the way her eyes never stopped scanning the blind spots. "My sister says you have nightmares," he said softly, testing the air. "She says you have the gaze of someone who is already dead." Zola's hand paused for a fraction of a second, a flicker of humanity crossing her otherwise mechanical expression before it was buried under a layer of professional ice. She looked up at him, her eyes hollowed by years of carrying unbearable weight. "I don't have nightmares, Mr. Park. I have memories that refuse to stay buried." She stood up, the tactical vest she wore creaking slightly as she adjusted her gear. "When I was in the Middle East, they didn't call me Zola. I was Black Zo 9. I was a weapon forged by people who believed that the ends always justified the means. They sent me into places that the world ignores, to do things that the history books won't record." She gestured toward the monitors showing the perimeter. "I've seen compounds like this one reduced to ash in seconds. I've seen families erased because a man with stars on his shoulder decided they were a variable. Every night, I see the faces of the 47 guards from that photograph. They weren't just targets. They were men with lives, and I ended them with the same clinical efficiency I'm using to save yours." Junho felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He recognized the trauma in her voice. It was the same resonance of a man who had built an empire on blood and now realized the foundation was rotting. "And now you're here," he said, "protecting a man your pride says you should reject." Zola returned to the wiring, her movements returning to their rhythmic, hypnotic pace. "I'm not here for you, Junho. I'm here because the monsters who made me are coming to collect their property. Commander Cole and his Spectre unit Don't leave loose ends. I'm a loose end that's been fraying for 3 years. She looked at the digital clock on her wrist. In 15 hours, the people who trained me will arrive. They will use the same pressure plates, the same tripwires, and the same psychological warfare I'm setting up now. They think they know how I think because they wrote the manual. What they don't know is that I've rewritten the last chapter. The mansion fell into a heavy, expectant silence as the final fortifications were completed. Zola had funneled the potential entry points into a series of killing zones, areas that appeared vulnerable but were actually designed to incapacitate intruders with surgical precision. She wasn't just building a defense, she was creating a stage for a reckoning. As she checked the tension on the final wire near the main entrance, she looked at Junho one last time. "Sleep if you can," she said, though her voice suggested it was an impossible request. "Tomorrow, the ghosts of my past are going to meet the reality of your future, and if we're lucky, only one of us will have to live with the consequences." She turned back to the monitors, a silent sentinel in a fortress of her own making, waiting for the full moon to rise and the nightmare to begin. The neon sign of the 24-hour convenience store flickered with a rhythmic, dying hum, casting erratic shadows across the aisles of instant ramen and cheap cigarettes. Zola Mariam stood in the back, her fingers tracing the condensation on a bottle of water, her mind miles away from the quiet streets of Seoul. She was a ghost in this city, a shadow that had successfully avoided the prying eyes of international intelligence for 3 long years. But peace is a fragile thing for a weapon designed for war. The bell above the door chimed, and 4 men burst in, their faces obscured by black gaiters, their hands gripping illegal firearms with the shaky adrenaline of desperate amateurs. They didn't see a black ops specialist. They saw a lone woman in a leather jacket and an elderly shopkeeper who looked like an easy mark. They began shouting in jagged Korean, waving their weapons at the terrified cashier, demanding the contents of the register and the dignity of everyone inside. Zola didn't move initially. She stayed in the shadows of the refrigerated aisle, her breath steady, her heart rate refusing to climb. She knew that the moment she engaged, the thin veil of her anonymity would tear forever. But then the lead robber turned his weapon toward a young woman cowering behind a display of snacks, his finger tightening on the trigger in a moment of panicked bravado. In that instant, the ghost vanished, and the weapon known as Black 09 took its place. The world slowed to a crawl as her muscle memory, forged in the fires of Libya and refined in the dark rooms of Spectre, seized control. She didn't think. She calculated. 4 targets, 2 firearms, 22 seconds of precise economical violence that would change the trajectory of her life. She moved before the first robber could finish his sentence. A bottle of mineral water became a projectile, catching the lead gunman in the temple with the force of a hammer. As he crumpled, Zola closed the distance with a speed that defied the store's low-resolution security cameras. Her left hand caught the second attacker's wrist, the bones snapping with a sickening wet pop as she redirected his firearm toward the ceiling. A single shot rang out, shattering a light fixture, but by then she was already behind him. A strike to the carotid artery sent him into instant unconsciousness. Target 3 tried to swing his heavy pistol like a club, but Zola moved inside his guard, her elbow connecting with his solar plexus, followed by a knee to the jaw that ended his participation in the robbery before he could even exhale. The fourth man, the youngest and most terrified, managed to back away toward the door, his hands shaking so violently the gun was a liability to everyone in the room. Zola didn't charge him. She picked up a discarded metal basket and launched it with a flick of her wrist, the heavy wire edge catching him across the bridge of his nose. As he recoiled in pain, she was on him, a hip throw slamming him into the linoleum with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. She disarmed him, cleared the chamber of his weapon, and stood over the 4 broken men with a clinical, hollow expression. Total elapsed time, 22 seconds. No wasted motion, no unnecessary cruelty, just the cold efficiency of a weapon doing exactly what it was designed to do. What Zola didn't know was that across the street, sitting in a black Mercedes with tinted windows, was parked Junho's last remaining trusted advisor. He had been monitoring the neighborhood for potential threats when the store erupted. He watched the footage on a handheld tablet, his eyes widening as he saw the woman move like a shadow in the night. He didn't see a customer. He saw a miracle born of violence. "We found someone," he whispered into a secure line to Junho. Someone impossible. By the time the sirens began to wail in the distance, Zola had disappeared back into the soul fog, leaving behind 4 unconscious men and the first digital breadcrumbs that would lead the Iron Dragon to her door. She had sought peace, but in 22 seconds of instinctive defense, she had signed her own return to the war she had tried so hard to forget. The mistake wasn't the violence. It was being seen by the only man in Korea desperate enough to hire a ghost. The clock on the wall of the Iron Dragon's sanctum flickered to the 12-hour mark, the red digits casting a bloody hue over the mahogany floors. Zola Mariam moved with the silence of a ghost through the east wing, her hand-held signal interceptor chirping with a low, persistent frequency that didn't belong in a residential compound. She was performing a secondary sweep, a deep tissue scan of the fortress that went beyond the cameras and the guards. The air in this part of the house was stale, smelling of old paper and the cold metallic tang of hidden machinery. Her device led her to the private quarters of Minsu, Park Junho's cousin, and the man who had most loudly protested her hiring. To anyone else, the room was a display of gaudy wealth, expensive watches, silk suits, and a lifestyle that far exceeded Minsu's legitimate salary. But Zola wasn't looking at the gold. She was looking for the seams in the reality he had constructed. She found it behind a false wall in the walk-in closet, a space hidden with the kind of architectural precision that required a professional contractor. Inside, the space was transformed into a sophisticated surveillance hub that looked less like a criminal's hideout and more like a tactical operations center. Multiple monitors flickered with live feeds, not just of the perimeter, but of the inner sanctum, including Junho's private office and his sister Suyun's quarters. The equipment was military-grade, high-end servers and satellite routing systems that bounced signals across continents to mask their destination. This wasn't the work of a rival gang. This was government-level intelligence. Zola's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart rate remaining steady, even as the magnitude of the betrayal settled in her mind. Minsu hadn't just been skimming profits. He had been selling the Iron Dragon's soul to the highest bidder, likely the Korean NIS or her own former handlers at Spectre. Detailed profiles of every member of the inner circle were pinned to a digital corkboard, each one marked with pressure points, bribery records, and psychological vulnerabilities. It was a decapitation manual, a step-by-step guide on how to dismantle the Iron Dragon Syndicate from the inside out. Zola pulled an encrypted drive from the main console, her jaw tightening as she realized the full moon threat hadn't been a warning. It was a coordinated execution scheduled by the very people Junho called family. Minsu had been the architect of the security gaps, the man who had provided the compound layouts to the 53 assassins currently closing in on the property. In the dark, the blue light of the monitors reflected in Zola's hollow eyes, making her look like the machine the military had tried to turn her into. Just as she began to download the routing logs, the floorboard behind her creaked, a sound so faint it would have been lost to anyone without her training. She didn't turn, she simply reached for the tactical knife at her waist. "You were always too smart for your own good, American." Minsu's voice drifted from the doorway, thick with a desperation that he tried to mask with his usual arrogance. He was holding a government-issue sidearm, his hand shaking slightly as he realized he was cornered in his own trap. Zola slowly turned to face him, the drive tucked into her vest. She didn't look at the gun. She looked at the man, seeing the cowardice hidden beneath the expensive suit. "You didn't do this for the money, Minsu," she said, her voice a clinical rasp that cut through his bravado. "You did it because you're afraid. You thought that by serving the shadows, you could become one of them." Minsu's finger tightened on the trigger, the sweat on his brow glistening in the monitor light. "They promised me a seat at the table once Junho was gone," he hissed, the lies he had told himself finally spilling out into the open. "They told me the Iron Dragon was a relic, a dinosaur waiting for the asteroid, I just gave them the coordinates. Zola took a step forward, ignoring the weapon pointed at her chest. The asteroid is already here, Minsu, but it's not the Ennius, and it's not Spectre. She moved with a speed that defied the cramped space, her hand catching his wrist and twisting it until the bone groaned, the gun clattering to the floor before he could fire a single shot. She didn't kill him. She needed him alive to answer to Junho. As she zip-tied his hands, the realization hit her. The betrayal ran deeper than one man's greed. The war hadn't just arrived at the gates. It had been sitting at the dinner table for years. The digital clock on Zola Mariam's wrist flickered to 10:17 p.m., the red numbers glowing like embers against the tactical black of her gear. The humidity of the Seoul night had settled into a heavy, expectant fog that clung to the 15-foot walls of the Iron Dragon's compound, turning the manicured gardens into a forest of shifting silhouettes. Inside the security hub, Zola stood motionless, her eyes tracking a series of thermal blooms on the perimeter monitors, heat signatures that moved with a synchronized, military precision that no common street gang could ever hope to replicate. The silence of the house was absolute, a manufactured stillness that masked the electrical hum of the high-frequency sensors she had spent the last 12 hours installing. She didn't reach for a firearm. Instead, she adjusted her earpiece and watched as the first three figures scaled the eastern wall, their movements fluid and practiced, completely unaware that they were stepping into a laboratory of controlled violence. The breach was surgical. The assassins used carbon fiber ladders to bypass the visible motion sensors, but they didn't account for the electrified wire mesh Zola had woven into the decorative ivy. As the lead operative's hand gripped a thick cluster of green leaves, 50,000 volts of non-lethal current surged through his frame. There was no scream, only the wet thud of a body hitting the grass, followed immediately by his two companions as the grid localized the strike. Zola didn't wait for the secondary sensors to confirm the hits. She ghosted through the side exit, her combat boots making no sound on the stone path she had memorized during her 48-hour vigil. She moved through the fog, not as a defender, but as a predator, reclaiming her territory, her hollow gaze fixed on the shadows where the rest of the first wave waited. She intercepted the next four attackers at the stone bridge, a natural choke point that funneled their movement into a narrow, vulnerable corridor. They were Yakuza specialists, men who valued speed and cold steel, but they were accustomed to enemies who fought with loud bravado. Zola emerged from the mist like a wraith, her first strike a clinical palm to the lead man's temple that short-circuited his equilibrium before he could draw his blade. She moved inside the second man's guard, her elbow connecting with his solar plexus in a strike so precise it forced the air from his lungs in a silent gasp. The third and fourth operatives managed to raise their weapons, but Zola used the second man's momentum as a shield, redirecting their line of sight before dismantling their formation with a series of nerve cluster strikes. In 9 seconds, the bridge was clear, and 4 more professional killers lay broken and unconscious on the mossy stone. Zola paused only to zip-tie their wrists and administer a fast-acting sedative, her expression as flat and emotionless as the concrete walls surrounding them. She wasn't seeking the catharsis of a kill. She was following the Spectre manual she had helped write, treating each neutralized threat as a data point to be managed. 7 down, she whispered into her comms, her voice a low rasp that barely disturbed the night air. From the shadows of the main balcony, Park Junho watched the carnage through a pair of thermal binoculars, his hands shaking as he realized that the woman he had hired wasn't just defending him. She was conducting a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. He had seen men die in dozens of ways, but he had never seen someone rendered so utterly powerless with such minimal effort. As the first wave's comms went silent, the perimeter erupted in a secondary, more aggressive assault. Explosive charges detonated at the southern gate, but the breach was a feint, a loud distraction designed to draw security away from the real target. Zola ignored the flames, her focus remaining on the pressure plates she had installed beneath the floorboards of the guest wing. She sensed the shift in the air before the monitors even registered the movement. a group of 8 mercenaries specialized in close-quarters assassination were currently funneling into the North Garden. She adjusted her tactical vest, the scars on her arms tingling with the familiar adrenaline of a mission that was finally entering its most dangerous phase. The laughter of the interview room was a distant memory, replaced by the mechanical reality of the 24-hour sentence. By the time the moon reached its zenith, Zola Mariam would ensure that the Iron Dragon's compound was the last place these men ever tried to breach. The digital clock on Zola Mariam's wrist hit 11:23 p.m., its crimson glow the only light in the suffocating darkness of the compound's secondary corridor. Outside, the fog had thickened into a damp shroud, but the thermal monitors in her periphery revealed a shift in movement that chilled her more than the night air. The first wave had been predictable, Yakuza and local mercenaries using brute force, but the second wave moved with a synchronized, rhythmic precision that made her blood run cold. They weren't clearing rooms, they were performing a Spectre box and pivot entry, a high-level tactical maneuver designed to eliminate blind spots. Zola watched a 4-man team breach the northern balcony, their hand signals subtle and their footwork perfectly balanced to minimize floorboard vibration. She recognized the cadence of their advance instantly. This was the Spectre Protocol, the same doctrine she had helped refine as Black Zone 9. These weren't just assassins, they were her brothers in arms, the men she had bled with in the trenches of Libya. A sharp, localized frequency jammer cut her internal comms, leaving her in a vacuum of silence. Zola didn't panic. She simply switched to a closed-loop analog channel she had hidden within the mansion's original wiring. The personal stakes of the 24-hour sentence had just escalated from a professional job to an existential reckoning. The men outside weren't here just for Park Junho's head. They were here to erase the only witness to the crimes of their unit. She moved to the edge of the shadows, her tactical knife held in a reverse grip, her heart rate remaining a steady, clinical 60 beats per minute, even as the ghosts of her past stepped into the light of the hallway. She saw the lead operative's silhouette, a man who moved with a slight hitch in his left shoulder, a lingering reminder of a shrapnel wound they had both survived 3 years ago. Spectre deployment on civilian soil, Zola whispered to the empty room, her voice a low, jagged rasp. Cole really has lost his mind. She didn't wait for them to find her. She triggered a localized blackout, plunging the entire north wing into absolute darkness. In the void, her night vision optics turned the world into a landscape of ghostly green and black. The Spectre team didn't falter. They immediately transitioned to infrared, but Zola had already anticipated their counter. She had rigged the hallway with high-output heat lamps that she now activated, blinding their thermal sensors with a wall of white-hot interference. In the moment of their sensory overload, she became the monster they had trained her to be. She struck the first operative as he recalibrated his goggles. It wasn't a fight, it was a dismantling. She used a joint lock that hyperextended his elbow before driving her palm into the base of his skull, rendering him unconscious before he could even register her presence. The second and third men pivoted toward her position, firing suppressed rounds that chewed into the mahogany paneling. But Zola was already low, sweeping the second man's legs and using his falling body as a barricade. She moved through the crossfire with a terrifying, mechanical grace, her strikes landing on nerve clusters and soft tissue with the force of a hydraulic press. She wasn't just neutralizing them. She was answering every insult the unit had ever heaped upon the broken soldier who chose to walk away. By the time the fourth operative realized he was alone, Zola had him pinned against a stone pillar, her knife pressed against the soft skin beneath his jaw. The man froze, his breathing ragged behind his tactical mask. "Black Zone 9," he wheezed, recognizing the signature efficiency of the woman who had been their most lethal asset. "You're a ghost, Zola. You're supposed to be dead." Zola didn't blink, her hollow gaze fixed on his eyes. The ghost found a reason to stay. She replied, her voice devoid of the mercy he was looking for. She didn't kill him, but the strike she delivered to his temple was enough to ensure he wouldn't be part of the final assault. As she zip-tied the last man of the fire team, she felt the eyes of Park Junho on her from the security monitors. He was watching a woman fight a war against her own reflection, seeing the raw, cold rage that fueled her professional exterior. Zola stood in the center of the silent hallway, surrounded by the men who represented everything she had tried to forget. The Spectre protocol had been breached, but she knew the commander would be next. The 24-hour clock was ticking toward midnight, and the ghosts were no longer just memories. They were lying at her feet, and the real hunter was still out there in the soul fog. Midnight arrived with the clinical precision of a blade, the full moon hanging over the Gangnam skyline like a cold, silver eye. In the central courtyard of the Iron Dragon's compound, the fog had thinned, leaving the space bathed in a surreal, metallic light that turned the manicured stone and decorative water features into a stage for a looming execution. Zola Mariam stood at the center of the garden, her breathing slow and rhythmic, her shadow stretching long and jagged against the white gravel. She was no longer just a bodyguard. She was a focal point of a global convergence of violence. Surrounding her were the elite, the insurance policies sent by the families who couldn't afford for Park Junho to survive the night. A Yakuza sword specialist from Tokyo, a Triad martial arts master from Hong Kong, and a Bratva enforcer who looked more like a mountain of scarred granite than a man. They moved with the arrogance of specialists who had never met an equal, their eyes scanning the lone woman with a mixture of professional curiosity and lethal intent. The Yakuza attacked first, his katana clearing its scabbard with a sound like a winter wind. He was a blur of silk and steel, his strike aimed at Zola's throat with the intent to end the night in a single, graceful arc. Zola didn't meet the steel with steel. She met his momentum with the vacuum of her own repositioning. She pivoted on her heel, her body becoming a ghost that the blade could not catch. As the swordsman overextended, she caught his wrist, redirecting the lethal force of his own swing into the stone pillar behind her. The bone in his forearm groaned before snapping, the sword clattering to the gravel as Zola delivered a precise nerve strike to his temple. 43 down. She didn't pause to admire the work. The Triad Master was already in her blind spot, his hands moving with the speed of 1,000 strikes. The courtyard erupted into a symphony of controlled violence. The Triad Master used a style designed for rapid-fire internal damage, his palms seeking the soft tissue of Zola's ribs and neck. Zola matched his frequency, her own hands becoming a blur of parries and counters. She wasn't fighting him, she was dismantling his rhythm. She stepped inside his reach, her elbow connecting with his solar plexus, followed by a palm strike that rattled his brain against his skull. As he collapsed, the Bratva enforcer charged, a human battering ram intended to crush her through sheer mass. Zola dropped low, catching his lead ankle and using his enormous weight to flip him over her shoulder. The earth shook as he slammed into the concrete, the impact knocking the air from his lungs in a wet, ragged gasp. 45 down. Zola stood in the center of the carnage, her tactical gear untouched, her expression remaining as flat and hollow as a desert midnight. The elite specialists, men who had spent decades perfecting the art of the kill, were lying at her feet, incapacitated by the very strength they had relied upon. From the safety of his office, Park Junho watched the monitors, his drink forgotten in his hand. He had expected a massacre, a blood-soaked finale to his 24-hour sentence, but Zola had given him something far more terrifying, a display of absolute, bloodless dominance. She had taken the world's most dangerous predators and treated them like unruly children, proving that true power didn't lie in the weapon, but in the person who knew how to let the weapon destroy itself. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of the city and the ragged breathing of the fallen. Zola didn't look at the men she had defeated. Her gaze was fixed on the shadows near the main gate, where the final threat awaited. She knew the Spectre unit wouldn't be satisfied with specialists. Commander Cole was coming, and he wouldn't be as arrogant as the Yakuza or as predictable as the Bratva. She adjusted the tension on her tactical vest, the scars on her arms throbbing with a phantom heat. The courtyard massacre had been a hollow victory, a warm-up for the only fight that actually mattered. As the clouds moved to reveal the full intensity of the moon, Zola Mariam prepared to face the man who had made her, knowing that by sunrise, only one of them would remain to tell the story of the night the Iron Dragon refused to die. The clock on Zola Mariam's wrist hit 1:04 a.m., the red numbers bleeding into the heavy fog that had reclaimed the central courtyard. The fallen elite, the Yakuza, the Triad Master, and the Bratva Giant were merely the opening acts for the man now stepping through the shattered main gate. Commander Marcus Cole moved with a terrifying, predator-like grace that Zola recognized in her own bones. It was the exact cadence of Spectre's highest tier of training. He didn't look like a mercenary or a criminal. He wore a charcoal tactical suit, stripped of insignia but radiating the authority of a man who had commanded global shadows for decades. In his hand, he held a heavy, suppressed sidearm with the casual ease of an extension of his own body. He stopped 20 feet from Zola, his gaze scanning the unconscious forms scattered across the gravel with a dismissive, clinical boredom. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. Black 09, Cole said, his voice a gravelly baritone that had once signaled her orders in the most desolate corners of the world. But the mission was never about these amateurs. It was always about you." She didn't look at his weapon. She looked at his eyes, finding the same cold vacuum that had once driven her into the abyss of her own nightmares. "The mission ended in Libya, Marcus," she replied, her voice a low rasp that cut through the humid night air. "I died there. Everything that walked out of those ruins belongs to me, not to Spectre." Cole laughed, a hollow sound that carried no humor. He holstered his weapon, a gesture of supreme confidence that signaled his intent to dismantle her personally. "You were the best weapon I ever made, Zola. But a weapon that refuses to fire is a liability. I'm not here for Junho's ledger. I'm here to reclaim the property that thought it could become a person." The duel began without a signal, a sudden eruption of high-level kinetic violence that moved too fast for the mansion's remaining security cameras to capture. Cole didn't fight like the specialists. He fought with the same Spectre doctrine Zola utilized, a style built on the economy of motion and the exploitation of anatomical weakness. They collided in the center of the courtyard, the sound of bone hitting bone echoing like muffled gunshots against the stone. Cole's strikes were heavy and precise, aimed at her nerve clusters with a familiarity that came from years of being her handler. He knew her favorite counters, her preferred pivots, and the slight hitch in her rhythm when she transitioned from defense to offense. He forced her back toward the fountain, his movements a blur of controlled aggression that pushed Zola to the very edge of her physical limits. Zola took a heavy blow to her ribs, the air escaping her lungs in a sharp hiss, but she didn't falter. She utilized the pain as an anchor, a reminder of the reality she had fought to reclaim. As Cole stepped in for a finishing strike to her throat, she didn't retreat. She moved into the vacuum of his reach, a maneuver he hadn't seen because she had developed it in the 3 years she had spent dead. She caught his lead arm, using a rotational hip lock to redirect his immense momentum. For the first time in his career, Marcus Cole found himself off balance. Zola didn't waste the opening. She delivered a series of rapid-fire strikes to his solar plexus and jaw, her hands moving with the desperate, jagged energy of a woman fighting for her soul. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, the moonlight reflecting off the sweat and blood on their faces. Cole wiped a smear of red from his lip, a twisted sense of pride flickering in his eyes. "You've changed, Zola. You're fighting for something now. It makes you predictable." He lunged again, but this time, Zola didn't fight him like a soldier. She fought him like the ghost he had called her. She used the environment, the shifting fog, the shadows of the pillars, the very moonlight itself, to obscure his line of sight. She was no longer Black 09, the weapon. She was Zola Mariam, the protector. The final exchange was a blur of silver and black. Cole reached for a concealed blade, but Zola intercepted his wrist, the bone groaning under the pressure of her grip. She used a high-leverage reversal that sent him into the stone edge of the water feature. As he tried to recalibrate, she delivered a final, decisive strike to his carotid artery. The commander's eyes widened, a moment of pure, unadulterated shock registering before the darkness took him. He slumped against the stone, the man who had controlled her life finally rendered powerless by his own creation. Zola stood over him, her heart rate finally beginning to descend from the red line. The 24-hour sentence was nearing its end, and the master had been defeated by the student who refused to be a slave. Across the street, the first hints of dawn were beginning to bleed into the horizon, but the war for the Iron Dragon's soul was far from over. The first rays of a bruised violet dawn began to bleed over the Gangnam skyline, illuminating the wreckage of the Iron Dragon's courtyard. Zola Mariam stood amidst the broken elite and the unconscious form of Marcus Cole, her breathing finally evening out as the adrenaline began its slow, painful retreat. The 24-hour sentence was over, but the air remained thick with a tension that hadn't dissipated with the arrival of the sun. Park Junho emerged from the fortified sanctuary of his office, his face ashen, looking like a man who had survived a shipwreck, only to realize the shore was a different kind of desert. He stopped at the edge of the gravel, his eyes moving from Zola to the shadows near the fountain where his sister, Su-yun, stood in total silence. She wasn't wearing the silk dress she had donned for dinner. She was in tactical gray, a government-issue sidearm holstered at her hip, her posture radiating a cold, professional authority that made Junho's world tilt on its axis. "You're late with the cleanup crew, Agent Song," Zola said, her voice a low, jagged rasp that cut through the morning mist. Junho spun toward his sister, his hands shaking. "Agent Song? Su-yun, what is she talking about?" The woman who had been his only tether to family for 48 years stepped into the light, her expression devoid of the warmth he had relied on. "Su-yun was the name our parents gave me, Junho," she said, her voice steady and clinical. "Agent Song-mi is the woman the NIS made me. I've been your handler for 20 years, not just your sister. My mission was never to destroy the Iron Dragon. It was to guide you toward legitimacy before the vultures like Spectre found a reason to pick your bones clean." Junho collapsed onto a stone bench, the weight of a lifetime of lies crushing the remains of his empire. The sister he had protected was the very person who had been monitoring his every breath for the state. Zola didn't offer comfort. She had no room left for it. She pulled a blood-stained ledger from Marcus Cole's tactical vest, a digital drive containing the names, bank accounts, and black site coordinates of every corrupt official Spectre had bought across 12 countries. This was the Iron Dragon's soul, the leverage Junho had used to keep the world at bay, now transformed into a roadmap for a global execution. "Spectre wanted this because it proves they exist," Zola stated, holding the drive up so the morning light caught its metallic edge. "Your sister's people want it so they can redact the names of their friends, but I want it for something else." She looked at Song-mi, the two women sharing a silent understanding, born of lives lived in the service of or against the shadows. "If we hand this over to the NIS, the cycle just starts again," Zola continued, her hollow gaze fixing on Junho. "New names, new black sites, same monsters. But if we burn it, if we release the unredacted truth to the world and use your resources to hunt what's left, we actually end it." Song-mi stepped forward, her hand hovering over her weapon, but she didn't draw. She saw the truth in Zola's eyes. The weapon was done being used. "The NIS will hunt you both," Song-mi warned. "You'll be ghosts in a world that doesn't allow for anonymity anymore." Junho looked up, a spark of his old fire returning as he looked at the woman who had saved his life. "I've been a ghost in my own house for 20 years, he said, his voice hardening. "I'd rather be a hunter in the light." With a flick of her thumb, Zola activated the drive's global broadcast protocol, a dead man's switch she had rigged during the lockdown. In seconds, the secrets of Spectre were being mirrored onto every major news server and independent journalist's terminal from Seoul to London. The ledger was effectively burning, its contents turning into a wildfire that no government could contain. The 53 assassins lying in the courtyard were no longer just prisoners. They were the first casualties of a new kind of war. Zola looked at the rising sun, the scars on her arms no longer throbbing. She wasn't Black 09 anymore, and Junho was no longer the Iron Dragon. They were two broken people who had decided to stop running. "Spectre has cells in 14 countries, Zola said, turning to Junho as Song-mi signaled the cleanup crews to move in. "It's time we showed them what happens when the weapon decides to hunt the hand that held it." The war in the shadows was over. The war in the light had just begun.